This episode of the Bonsai Network podcast is brought to you by Eisei-en Bonsai. Eisei-en is a full-service bonsai nursery located just outside of Nashville, Tennessee. To schedule a visit to Eisei-en, head over to www.eisei-en.com. That's www.eisei-en.com. Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. As you can see, we've been a little bit more consistent over the last few weeks in putting out episodes. As a matter of fact, I managed to get through about an episode every 2 weeks, which was my initial goal to begin with. So I hope I haven't jinxed myself going forward now that I've just said that, but it feels pretty good to have been able to keep on a consistent, regular schedule with these podcasts, and we're going to try to do that going forward. So I thought for this episode it might be interesting, since we're getting ready to go into the winter season here in the Northern Hemisphere, that it would be interesting to talk about how to sort of overwinter and protect your trees to some degree. One reason that I'm really into this right now is because we actually just had an Arctic blast come down from the north this last week. And here in Nashville, we got down to 15 degrees Fahrenheit or -9, -10 Celsius, which is very rare for this time of year in the South. Normally, we don't run into temperatures like that until we get into, say, late January, early February, and only for a few days here and there. It's not really something we see consistently every year. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about what we had to do this past week with the trees and what we're going to be doing going forward into the winter. So this last week, I hadn't really put up the poly house quite yet, which is where we're going to be storing our trees over the winter. So just for basic protection for those 1 or 2 nights that we got down to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, -9 Celsius, I put all of the trees on the ground. Now, the reason I did this is because the ground temperature will actually regulate the temperature within the pots to some degree. So even if the air temperature is very, very cold, the ground temperature is going to be significantly warmer, anywhere from 5 to 10, sometimes 15 degrees warmer, depending on the situation. So that is then absorbed up into the pot, and it keeps the roots much warmer during those cold spells. So, if you have just kind of a one-off cold spell like this, where you're getting down to, say about 15, -9 Celsius, you can put the trees on the ground and you really shouldn't run into many problems. Although if you're going to have extended periods of really cold weather like that, you may want to think about doing something different. We're going to talk about what to do a little bit later in this podcast. But before we jump into that, I want to talk about how the cold actually affects temperate trees. So it all depends on kind of what temperature we're getting down to. It also depends on what species we're talking about, but we're just going to kind of generalize here for the most part, because I know a lot of you guys out there work with many different species, and to go through each individual one and try to figure out, exactly what the limitations are in terms of their cold hardiness is kind of, it's difficult to do. There's no way we could do it in a podcast format like this. So I want to give you kind of some general guidelines to follow that you can then apply to a majority of your temperate trees. So, as a general rule of thumb, obviously water is going to freeze at 32 degrees, but that's if it is pure H2O. So a majority of the water that we're dealing with has other things dissolved in it, other minerals, other nutrients. So the freezing temperature of water, say in a pot, for example, that's mixed with the nutrients that are in the pot, that water is not going to freeze right at 32 degrees. It's actually going to freeze at a little bit lower temperature than that. So 30, 31 degrees, and this is Fahrenheit, obviously. So you're looking at about -1, maybe as far down as -2 Celsius, where the water will actually freeze in the pots. So if the water freezes in the pots, it's not that big a deal at that temperature. It's when we get to much lower temperatures that we run into some issues with potential damage to the roots. So, the air temperature being freezing, a little bit below freezing, not that big a deal for almost all temperate trees that we deal with. It's not going to, cause cell death, which is what causes branch dieback or entire tree dieback. But freezing temperatures on the root system sometimes can affect the health and will affect the health of those roots faster or sooner than they will affect the health of the foliage on a plant, the branching on a plant. And the reason that is because trees in nature grow in the ground. They aren't in pots. They aren't up on the benches. They aren't suspended in the air. They're in the ground, and those roots are penetrating deeper and deeper into the ground via a process called gravitropism. So as those roots penetrate further into the ground, they're further away from that cold air temperature, so they're less likely to come in contact with very, very cold temperatures. So when you have the trees out of the ground in a pot, obviously, that's out of the ground, so the temperature isn't the same. It's going to be much colder, much faster around that root system. So you need to be protecting the root system to a larger degree than you do the foliage necessarily. And again, we're talking right around sort of freezing temperature. So again, if you take your trees, put them on the ground when the temperatures dip below 0 Celsius or about 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the ground temperature is going to warm up those roots and keep them nice and toasty for the evening or for the day, whatever time it happens to get down to that temperature. And when you start getting down into the lower 20s, say about 23 degrees Fahrenheit, which I believe is probably about -6 degrees Celsius, it should be about right, somewhere right around there, you start running into an issue where the trees are actually, as a defense mechanism, releasing water from inside of their cells. They're releasing that water to the area in between the cells. And this is a defense mechanism. In temperate plants, they'll release that water into that middle area between the cells, and the water will freeze right there. So the reason that the trees do this is because if the water stays in the cell and the cell itself actually freezes, that'll kill the tree or it'll kill the branch on the tree. So as a defense mechanism, that water gets released into the area between the cells. It freezes there. The tree will survive. The branch will survive. And again, this is for most temperate trees down to about that 23 degree Fahrenheit, say -6 degrees Celsius limit there. When you start getting lower than that, say down to about 14, 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which is that -9, -10 degrees Celsius range, the issue is that the cells themselves, the liquid remaining in the cells, will actually freeze. And this is when you start running into cell death in the plant. This is the actual tree itself freezing, and you'll run into branches dying off or entire trees dying off. So this, again, is different for different species. So there's going to be a lower threshold for trees, for example, that are growing up in high mountainous regions. Like if you're dealing with Yamadori, like Rocky Mountain junipers, for example, that are collected at 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 feet, those trees are going to be more cold resistant than trees that are growing at lower elevations. But as a general rule of thumb, it's just a good idea to sort of understand that lower limit of about 14, 15 degrees Fahrenheit, -9, -10 Celsius. That's a good lower limit for the safety of most of your trees. If it's going to be getting down to that temperature, lower than that temperature, the trees really need to be protected in a different manner than just setting them on the ground. So this brings us to sort of what we do at Eisei-en here, or what we will be doing going forward into the first, technically the second winter that we've since we've been opened here at Eisei-en in Nashville. So I want to talk to you guys about what we're planning on doing this year, what we did last year, what's going to be different this time around, and hopefully give you some ideas for overwintering your trees. So like I said, this last week for that cold spell that got down to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, we just chucked everything on the ground because it's only going to be for a few hours for one night, and then the temperatures were expected to go back up again to their normal levels for November and early December. So I didn't want to move everything inside to the workshop just for one night of protection. So, it is a little bit risky, but we threw everything on the ground. I did move the slightly more susceptible trees susceptible to frost damage into the workshop that night just for safety's sake. So, for example, the chojibai that we have here, the olives, the California olives, those trees have to stay above freezing. The coastal redwoods, those trees can get down to, say, 28, 29 degrees Fahrenheit. But again, just for safety's sake, we moved those into the workshop. But everything else we had, including the maples, we put on the ground outside, let them get down to that 15-degree mark. And it seems like everything is fine at this point. So the temperatures went back up the next day, not a problem. Now, as we're going into deep winter here, getting into December, January, and February, Like I said before, we're going to get down to those low temperatures on a relatively consistent basis, particularly when we get into late January, early February. We'll be hitting those, teen degrees in Fahrenheit during that particular period. So just for added safety, what we're doing is building a poly house here. So I don't know if you guys have seen one of the more recent vlogs that I did about building the benches, new benches at the nursery here. I built a shade structure out of pressure treated wood above those benches with the intention of putting shade cloth over that during the summer months. But that same structure is going to double up as a poly house during the winter months. So what we do is we take off the shade cloth at the end of the growing season when the temperatures start dropping a little bit. And then in late November, early December, we'll be throwing on poly on top of that. So we've got big sheets of poly that we've purchased from a site called Greenhouse Megastore. It's a great online shop for all things, greenhouse and nursery maintenance. So if you want to check that out, you can go do that for sure. But we ordered the poly from them. It should be coming in here shortly. We're going to be covering that structure with the poly. Now, you can get poly at like 3 millimeter thickness, which should be sufficient for most people in most climates here in the sort of temperate range of the Northern Hemisphere. And again, in Nashville here, we're about zone 7A, 7B, somewhere right around there. So we don't get super cold, but the further north you get, the thicker the poly you're going to want to get. And also, that 3 mil poly, it works. It works fine down here, but if you're going to be using it and then taking it off and reusing it and taking it off, it's going to tear and deteriorate pretty quickly. So 5 mil poly or 6 mil poly may be a better option, even in areas where it doesn't get super cold. So we're going to be putting on here 5 mil poly because we are going to be reusing this poly year after year. So we'll be draping it over the structure, the wood structure that I built just a few months ago. And the sides of the poly, will be able to roll those sides up so that for a majority of the winter, we're just getting overhead protection on the trees. You're not getting that hard frost landing directly on the trees, but there's still air circulation coming underneath the poly walls. Because, of course, if it's sunny outside, it's going to heat up the inside of that poly house quite significantly. And we're not going to have, a release or an opening on the top to allow for, air to escape through the top. So we're going to do that through the sides of the poly house. Now, again, the structure that I built is about, I think, 11 or 12 feet tall. It's very, very tall. So there's a lot of space for that heat to rise up above the trees. But if you've got a poly house that's low, say it's only 3, 4, 5 feet tall, and you're putting your trees, say, on the ground underneath that poly house, the heat is going to get trapped a little bit lower and could potentially cause damage to the trees, or it could cause the trees to wake up significantly earlier than you want them to. So keep that in mind. Higher ceiling is definitely a better option, particularly if you don't have an opening at the top to release hot air. So the sides, again, are going to be rolled up for a majority of the season, but when we get down to temperatures that are in the mid-20s Fahrenheit, so around 25, 23 degrees, so, -5, -6 degrees Celsius, we'll be rolling those poly walls down for added protection. And, in extreme cases, say when we get down below, -10 degrees Celsius, so below that 15 degree Fahrenheit mark, we will likely put a heating source into the poly house during the night hours, just to keep the temperatures a little bit warmer. But you got to keep in mind too that when you're putting a whole bunch of trees into a poly house like that, particularly trees that are coniferous or that maintain their foliage over the winter, you're going to get transpiration occurring within that poly house, and through that transpiration, you actually get the production of heat. So the trees themselves will actually heat up the inside of a poly house or the inside of a greenhouse just via the process of transpiration, which is pretty cool. So, like I said, we're only going to put a heat source in there if we really get down to extremely low temperatures here. But other than that, the walls will just be closed down on either side. The heat from the plants will heat that area up for the course of an evening. And as long as we're keeping those trees, above that bottom threshold of about, -9 degrees Celsius, 15 degrees Fahrenheit, we shouldn't have really much of any problem. Now, that being said, the absolute ideal situation, since every tree that we're working on, every branch is important. We're selecting, cutting off branches we don't need, moving branches we do need into the proper places. Every branch is important in the design of a bonsai. So, we don't really want to risk dieback on any of our trees, because it will ruin the design of the tree. So the absolute ideal situation would be to build a perfect greenhouse that you can keep at about 33 to 38 degrees, so just above freezing. So what would that be? About 1 degree to say 3 or 4 degrees Celsius over the course of the entire winter, just keeping it in that range there. So that the trees transpire, they're still absorbing water. You can water them on a regular basis. They never freeze, but they do stay dormant for the entire winter. Right? That would be the absolute ideal situation. But for a majority of people, including myself, that's not really something that can be done. It's cost prohibitive. It's very labor intensive to set something like that up. It's just not realistic for most people. So second to that, what you can do if you don't want to build a poly house, like we just talked about, what you can do is find an unheated garage. So if you've got an unheated garage, you can throw your trees in there. Most people's unheated garages are attached to their house, so you get that radiant heat from the house coming into that unheated garage, which is going to keep it right around that freezing temperature. And honestly, in the winter, you don't actually need a light source for your trees. The coniferous material that's maintaining its foliage over the course of the winter, it's still photosynthesizing during the winter, but it's very, very minimal photosynthesis that's occurring during the winter months. So you could put the trees ostensibly in pitch black darkness for the entire winter season, and you're not going to see really any detriment to the trees, even if you do it year after year after year. It's not a problem at all. As a matter of fact, on the flip side of that, if you have coniferous material that's outside in bright sun over the course of the winter, because photosynthesis is occurring at such a low rate during those months, you have too much light hitting the foliage on those trees, it can actually cause something called photo-inhibition, which is essentially burning of the foliage over the course of the winter. The trees are absorbing too much sunlight and not turning that into food for itself, not producing sugars and carbohydrates for itself through the process of photosynthesis. So you can actually run into damage of the foliage if you leave them outside in too much light. So putting them in a low light situation like that, inside of an unheated garage is a great option. And if you got a small collection, that's probably one of the best ways to overwinter your trees. Now, that being said, you got to be extra careful, in that situation and just in general in the winter, making sure that you're watering your trees consistently. Of course, the watering schedule is going to be completely different than it would be, in the rest of the year when you have foliage on the trees and the trees are growing. But you want to make sure that the core of the root system, that core that's right up underneath the trunk itself, is not becoming bone dry. Because the tendency in the winter for a lot of folks is, you see the soil surface, it still seems relatively wet, so I'm just going to leave the tree alone. Well, that internal core may be drying out. It may be bone dry, and the surface of the soil might be wet. So it's still good, once a week if possible. In most cases, particularly if the trees are above freezing or if they're thawing and freezing, to make sure to water deeply about once a week so that you can get that core soil up under the trunk nice and soaked, so that the tree survives. You don't get dieback in the spring because the tree dried out too much over the winter. Another thing we would do at Fujikawa-san's place, actually this is probably a good opportunity to talk about what we did at Fujikawa-san's place. So at Fujikawa-san's nursery, we were in Osaka, which is, I think it's a similar zone situation to what we have here in Nashville, so around 7. I'm not exactly sure what the number would be, but the temperatures are nearly identical throughout the year. But what we would do at his place is everything would stay on the benches. Except for a handful of species. We would move into what was called the tenjijo, which is, it translates to like display room, but it was essentially an unheated room with just a few windows on one side, very, very deep, long room we would place, for example, Japanese maples in there. Trident maples would go in there. Japanese flowering apricots. Any tree that was going into the kokufu, for example, would be put into that room, mainly because we wanted to protect the conifers from what was called shimoyaki, which is basically frostburn. So if you put conifers outside, most of them in the winter, if they get frostburn on them, they'll turn a purple or a brown color. Well, you could have the most killer tree in the world that's going to go into the kokufu, but if it's got frostburn, the judges won't let it in the show. They want the trees to look green. They need to be dormant, but they want them to look green for the show. If you have a whole bunch of purple and brown trees at the kokufu, it looks like the trees are dead. The general public's going to think something's up, something's kind of weird. So to protect those trees, we would also put them in the tenjijo. And that room, like I said, it had a few windows on the side, but there was very minimal light that was actually getting into that particular room. So again, that wasn't a big deal for the health of the trees. But because the trees with foliage in particular that were going in the kokufu were put inside of that room, they weren't getting a lot of moisture. There wasn't a lot of humidity in the air during the winter months. So we would bring the hose in to that room almost every night at the end of every day and mist the foliage on the coniferous material. Again, this is material that was going into the kokufu, so this was an added layer of protection to make sure that they stayed green over the course of the winter leading up to the kokufu in February. So this isn't necessarily something you need to do with your trees in winter storage, but it doesn't hurt to mist the foliage on occasion, particularly of the coniferous material that you're keeping either in an unheated garage or in a polyhouse situation either. So, again, the best case scenario is to keep your trees above that 32 degree Fahrenheit mark up to, about 38 degrees, somewhere in that range. But short of that, making sure that you protect them by putting them on the ground or putting them in a polyhouse, protecting them from the wind. Wind is another major issue in the winter that'll cause desiccation, particularly of coniferous material. So putting them in a polyhouse like that or building a structure around the trees to prevent the wind from slapping against the foliage, that's another good option as well. And of course, like I said before, you don't necessarily need a major light source over the course of the winter either. So, hopefully that gives you kind of a general rule of thumb as to what to look for in terms of low temperatures and some of the basic options that you have available to you to overwinter your trees. But every climate is different, every location is different, every person's needs are different, the species that you're working with are going to be different. So if you really want to dial it in specifically for each species, you're going to have to do a bit more research than what I've provided for you here. But hopefully that gives you a good base to go off of to start with. Thank you for checking out this episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. To have your questions answered in a future episode, please send them to podcast@bjornbjorholm.com. That's podcast@bjornbjorholm.com.